Hello, America. This is Jack Johnson, your all-American radio host, coming at you live from Radio DBD here in the great city of Philadelphia on this lovely 31st of December. This week on Coming At You, I thought we'd try something a little different, so I came up with this list with the help of my wonderful producers. A list of the biggest triumphs and flops of the 1920s as we approach the dawn of tomorrow. A decade that was full of conflict and celebration, with everything from Prohibition to the Scopes monkey trial, and even that great case of Sacco and Vanzetti. So round up the chitlins and send them off to bed, have your wife fix you a snack, and let us settle in and prepare, because this one is going to be a doozy for this week on Coming At You. Let us start off with everyone's favorite, Prohibition. Prohibition has been a hot topic for centuries, but it really took off when some Protestants teamed up with some progressives from the Democratic and Republican parties and began to form these anti-saloon leagues. These supporters of Prohibition, also known as Drive, presented the moral implications alcohol had on the family and even one's own health. They believed that most men were wasting their days and their money away drunk and hungover, putting a toll on their family and risking their jobs in the process. The anti-prohibitionists, also known as Wets, drew their power from the idea that this ban was nothing but an intrusion, a way to impose the Protestant ideals onto the mostly Catholic and hated immigrant population. But there was no stopping Prohibition, because in 1917, the 18th Amendment was proposed, and by January of 1920, the entire nation was forced to go dry. The government had banned the sale, production, importation, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, which was then followed up by the Volstead Act, which outlined the implications of the amendment. Now, even though during this time the rate of consumption of alcohol dropped anywhere from 60 to 80%, so in that aspect, I guess the score is 1-0 in favor of the Protestant. Organized crime flourished. Bootlegging, which is the smuggling of alcohol, became a huge money maker for the mafia gangs, and when money is involved, crime cannot be far behind. Cities such as New York and Chicago became a feeding ground for violence between gangs as they vied for control of the black market for liquor. And there was nothing that would stand in their way to do so. Theft and burglary rose, drug addiction and assault rose, homicides rose, all in turn rose the cost of running the police department to combat these crimes exponentially. You could say that these are some pretty persuasive reasons to repeal Prohibition. Now, the 1920s came just after the World War, which just so happened to coincide with the fall of Russia's government and their turn to communism. Once the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar, the newspapers began to run these accounts of the violence in Russia, accounts that were filled with blood and horror and the unspeakable. This worried Americans, for if this could happen in Russia, could it happen in the US? Plus, if we switch from capitalism to communism, the wealthy and even the middle class feared their money and wealth would be taken and distributed among the masses, an even scarier thought. This fear soon blossomed into what would become this nationwide panic known as the Red Scare. Soon, every strike, bombing, and riot was suspected to have been the work of a communist. Americans were stricken with fear and hatred. Europe was not seen as our friend now, but as a breeding ground for socialism and communism, both enemies of capitalism. And since most immigrants were from Europe, they were the prime targets for the blame. Soon, this terror bloomed into a full-fledged fear of all people from different countries, or xenophobia. To combat the influx of immigrants, and therefore the influx of crime and anarchy, the U.S. government introduced these quotas beginning in 1921. The emergency quota of 1921 was a temporary solution, which allowed 3% of the people of a certain nationality into the U.S. based upon the 1910 census. Unfortunately, this favored Southern and Eastern Europeans, who had just grown in size due to the influx of the new immigrants in the late 19th century, where most people came from an undemocratic or anarchist country. This was later revised with the Immigration Act of 1924, which now only allowed 2% of people of a certain nationality into the U.S. based upon the 1890 census, which favored the old immigrants who stemmed from Northern and Western Europe, who had a background in democracy. This was supposed to stop the massive influx of radicals and anarchists into the U.S., but does this make me wonder? The way we treated these people and the stigma we attached to them, should we have been more afraid of them, or should they have been more afraid of us? Let us all go back to April 15th, 1920. A paymaster for a shoe company in Massachusetts is shot and killed along with his guard. The murderers escaped with more than $15,000 that night. The two men arrested were Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, both Italian anarchists who believed in the destruction of oppressive governments. This trial would soon become the decade's showcase for anti-radical and anti-immigration sentiment. These two men were sentenced to death by electrocution a little over a year after these crimes were committed. But something was not right during the proceedings. The authorities had failed to come up with any evidence of the stolen money. Testimonies varied on whether the two men were seen together on that night, or even at the scene of the crime. Conflicting ballistic evidence, and even a confession from an alleged participant in the robbery. A series of appeals followed the sentence for almost 6 years, making it all the way to the Massachusetts State Supreme Court, where it was reviewed after that there was a public outcry. Hundreds of influential citizens pleaded for a new trial or for their pardon, for they saw the true implications behind the sentencing of these two Italian men. Now, how could these two men, under such loose evidence and disregarded testimony, have been sentenced to death for a crime they couldn't have been proven to have committed? I don't need an answer, because there is not an acceptable one. These men were wrongly executed, and this is just another blatant example of the rising prejudice that fell upon immigrants in America following the fall of Russia and the rise of communism and anarchy. This was not a murder case, but a case of one character. There was no strong case to build against these two men, so the prosecutor played upon America's insecurities, their fear of immigrants and anarchy. These two men were not guilty of murder, only of being Italian anarchists, in the wrong spot at the wrong time. And it is with that I ask you to consider, is it better to convict these monstrosities before they commit an act of violence based upon their character, or to wait and see? Now, a message from our sponsors. Are you having trouble getting little Jimmy and sweet little Sally to eat their breakfast in the morning before they head out on that long walk to school? Most mothers are, and that's why I ask you, have you tried Wheaties? It is the new cereal that will be sweeping the nation. It is something new that makes the cereal-hating child go for a great big breakfast of whole wheat mornings. Not only is it delicious for the kids to love it, but it is nutritious for the parents to love too. Your kids will tell you they're swell, and maybe even bother you for a second bowl. But it's up to you if they can have it. Ha 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 ha. So that is why you should head on out to that good old corner store and pick up a box on your next shopping trip, ladies. Don't be stingy. Be the groundbreaking mother who can provide for her kids in the morning. And ask your kids, have you tried Wheaties? The Scopes monkey trial questioned the very basis of American morality, evolution. Formerly known as the State of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, was a 1925 court case where Mr. Scopes, a high school biology teacher, was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which prohibited public school teachers from teaching anything that differs from the biblical account of man's origin in public schools. This case was staged and sparked to start the debate between modernists, who believed in a meshing of evolution and science within religion, and fundamentalists, who believed that the word of the Lord trumped any theories or proof humans could substantiate. Most fundamentalists believed that these theories would destroy the youth's belief in God and the Bible, and their morality. On the prosecutor's side was William Jennings Bryan, the Henry Clay of the 20th century, a hardcore Presbyterian fundamentalist who thought that this trial would be the contest between evolution and Christianity, a duel to the death. And on the defense there was Clarence Darrow, who had a famed criminal lawyer, who took this case in the hopes of challenging the legality of the Butler Act in a much higher court. Darrow contested the factuality of the Bible and verbally attacked Bryan while he sat on the stand, then asked the judge for an immediate direct verdict, which came back as guilty. This was more than fine for Darrow. He was what he had wanted, continuing his fight in the Supreme State Court. But unfortunately, the whole case was thrown out on a technicality. and the statue was never truly contested, and was left intact in its entirety. Darrow had failed, and Brian had passed away before he had seen his enemy's defeat. How tragic. With that, I leave you one question to ponder. Is it better to cling to the past, or to explore the unknown future? Oh, wow. Now, this is a good one. You see, the strange part about the 1920s would have to be the differences and conflicts between the urban and rural communities of the United States. Take a look at any issues during this decade and you could describe it as a geographical conflict more than anything. Look at Prohibition, which we already discussed. It is not a fight between drunks and housewives, but a fight between strict Protestant beliefs and the more free-flowing Catholics who resided in the more urban communities. Or even take a look at the treatment of Negroes in the South. The KKK, or Ku Klux Klan, was experiencing a revival of itself, which I'll go into more detail later on, which was a stark juxtaposition between the flourishing blacks in the cities, particularly that Harlem Renaissance, which allowed for the creative expression of thousands of African Americans, Langston Hughes and Louis Armstrong, or Claudette McKay and Eubie Blake, all stemmed from this period of black pride, and where some even argued for a new Negro, who was a full citizen and socially equal to whites. Some even adopted modernist techniques, all while blacks in the South are segregated and bullied by the KKK. These strong beliefs in both the rural and urban communities are a hotbed for debate and controversy. In almost all matters, the rural southern communities took the more traditional viewpoint, which favored whites, Protestant Americans, while the urban/northern communities took the more unusual or modern path that favored Catholics and was less harsh on minorities and immigrants. It makes me wonder, will the South ever be seen as progressives, or will it be regarded as lacking and backwards? Now back to the KKK, which I mentioned before. The Klan was founded by a group of Southerners who opposed Reconstruction in the South during the Civil War, but as Reconstruction took off, the KKK lost its drive and disbanded. But in 1915, when William Joseph Simmons saw the film Birth of a Nation, he revived the Klan and started the massive uptake of Klan ideals in the 1920s. But with this Klan, their target audience grew much smaller, and their targets grew larger. Now, not only blacks were the main proponent of hatred in the KKK, but now also Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. Their members are fundamentalists and extreme nativists, mostly from rural and agricultural communities, who attack the elite urbanites and intellectuals. Their memberships range anywhere from 3 to 8 million Klansmen, and included not just the destitute, but also the middle-class Americans who come from respected professions such as doctors, lawyers, and ministers. But this time the Klan is not stuck in the South. In Ohio and Pennsylvania there's a combined 500,000 members. The Klan was done with their just small meetings and little to no power. They soon devised a strategy called the Decade, in which every member of the Klan was responsible for recruiting 10 people to vote for the Klan's candidates in elections. This went off without a hitch. Soon the Klan held such prestigious positions as mayor in major cities such as Portland, Maine, and Portland, Oregon. In some states, such as Colorado and Indiana, the Klan had gathered enough members in the assembly to effectively control the state government. This reign is known as the Invisible Empire, and its presence was felt across the country in various forms. My question to you, my audience, would be, how do we stop such a powerful group whose main ideals scream such hatred and racism without a full-blown war? Or do we just let it ride on out? Now, another word from our sponsors. Wow, isn't it cold out there? Brr. December can be really rough on the soul, and that's why you should cuddle up under a blanket, surround yourself with your family, and sit everyone in front of the fireplace. But wait, now it's getting too toasty. I bet you're regretting that turtleneck right about now, haha. Well, don't worry, we have something to cool you down, and it's tasty too. To try our new and improved Eskimo pies. Don't be fooled by our competitors over at Good Humor and that nasty Klondike bar. Yuck. You need the real, the original, the Eskimo pie. Now come on, and run on down to the good old corner store, and rustle up all that spare change Grammy has been sneaking you, and buy yourself an Eskimo pie. Or hey, maybe even two. Do 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 do. The 1920s have been a decade of rejuvenation following the World War. The nation, for the first time, was starting to see radio at a national level. It knits our nation together with broadcasts on a wide variety of topics, ranging from news and music to politics and comedy. And for the first time in forever, the mechanization of all of these products created an abundance, making it affordable for majority of the nation, allowing everyone to come home and turn on their radio and just relax. Now, it was not just radios that were mass-produced, but also cars. This idea of a moving assembly line, or Fordism, was employed, and cars were being spit out by the millions. But radio is nothing compared to the talkies. Back in 27, there was the jazz singer starring Al Johnson, which became the first of its kind with its use of voice. And not far behind it came an abundance of color films beginning to be produced. The nation had a new lens to look through. With this new age of freedom and expression, there came jazz, which spread from New Orleans with the great migration of African Americans in search of improved economic opportunities during the war. Along with the music came advancements in literature, a shift from the stagnant, overdone plots of yesterday, and a shift to a more youthful storyline. These newfound writers came from the outside, not from stuffy New England, like most of the writers that came before them, and a resentment towards outdated ideals. Their prose focused upon the cruelty of society and the disillusionment of America and its ideals. This new culture was one that had the means and the motivation to challenge the established. Now here we are at my last point, and how ironic is it? It's women! In the beginning of the decade, the U.S. ratified the 19th Amendment, enfranchising all women, and at the same time, their World War had just ended and they were finishing the job their husband had left to go off and fight. Once these men returned and women were given the right to vote, it was assumed that they would just return to the home and live out their days in peace. But this was not the case. Women enjoyed their employment and looked for jobs once their husbands returned home. This new sense of freedom and empowerment grew so large that women rebelled. They no longer aspired to be a Gibson girl with their long hair, hourglass figure, elegant gowns, but rather a flapper. Flappers cut their long hair for a bob, rejected the waist-constricting corsets, and adopted a rather unisex look, with dresses coming at knee length and drop waists. And on their faces they began to wear makeup, which, prior to the 20s, which were regarded as a sign of promiscuity. Women now smoked and drank alcohol, two pastimes that were reserved for men, and loved automobiles for their speed and risk. Some even insisted on being drivers as well as passengers. Some of these women went even as far as to alter the stigma attached to sex and the conversation of it. Most flappers had grown up to be educated about sex and therefore wanted to discuss, as well as experience. Ladies nowadays had no qualms about dancing close, necking in the back seats of a car, or even premarital sex. The idea of sex as immoral and shameful is no longer the case. But as this decade comes to a close, we can reflect upon the actions of the flappers and their counterparts, as they had little impact in the steps towards a liberal society. Many of their changes in behavior and gender roles were unsuccessful. Few women went for the full-fledged flapper experience, and that in itself made it less successful in terms of change. Now, ladies and gentlemen alike, I would like to bid you adieu, for this program is wrapping up just as this day is. I'd like to wish all of you and your families a happy and healthy new year, and to a promising decade. I know some of you may be troubled by the recent economic downturn, but I can guarantee it will not last long. Or at least I hope so. But before we go, I'd like to leave you with one last question to ponder as we enter a fresh decade. What have you learned from the last 10 years? I can think of a few things myself. And, well, quite ridiculous. We'll take that answer from that question and apply it for how you will live your life for the next decade, and the next, and hopefully the next. Now good night and farewell. This is Jack Johnson signing off for Radio DBD, here in the greatest city in the United States.